Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the December program meeting of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. Uh, this is tonight we'll hear a timely subject in the time of pandemic where a large portion of our population is really concerned about human health and public safety and the efficacy and safety of the new drugs that might be coming down the line. So we're going to take a historical perspective here and from a scholar who is a social historian. Tamara Venit-Shelton has been an associate professor at Claremont McKenna College. She's been teaching there since 2012. And before that, she taught for 3 years at Reed College in Oregon. But let me jump back for a second here. She actually received her bachelor's from Amherst College in French and history. And she was very successful, magna cum laude, I see from her CV, but that enabled to get into Stanford, where she received her MA and her PhD in history. She's published in many places, but she's also produced a couple of books, A Squatter's Republic, Land and Politics of Monopoly in California from 1850 to 1900, and also the most recent book, Herbs and Roots, A History of Chinese Medicine in the American Marketplace. I'll let her do the talking, but I would like to inform all of you in case you didn't hear Susan Dixon's comments earlier. This program is being recorded and will be available on YouTube for review at a later point. So we welcome your Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button to push for questions. And so after the presentation by Professor Venit-Shelton, we will go through some questions that you may have. So thank you, and we'll talk to you a little bit later. And may I introduce Professor Venit-Shelton.
Thank you so much, Gene. Thank you for that nice introduction. I am really thrilled to be here with you all, at least virtually, tonight, at least partly because one of your members, Gilbert Hom, who I know is here, was such a tremendous help to me in writing this book. I don't know if you know Gilbert or you know what an amazing researcher he is, but he really taught me so much about Chinese herbalists, and a lot of the research that he did, I was actually able to make use of for this book. So this is a great opportunity for me to give that shout out to Gilbert and say thank you again for all that you did to help make this book a reality. So Herbs and Roots, A History of Chinese Doctors in the Medical Marketplace. I've been giving a lot of talks this year and saying, oh, this is my new book. I realized that my book actually just had its first birthday. So I think now I can't actually call it a new book. But well, I guess these things are sort of relative. So I'm going to spend about 40 minutes giving you a little kind of tour through the book, and then I'm happy to take questions. But as I always say when I give a talk, I am a historian. I am not a medical scientist, so I'm not going to field any questions about if it works. I always get those kinds of questions, and I'm not actually qualified to answer them. So let me start here sharing my screen. If you just give me a moment, and I'll just hope that Laureen maybe lets me know if you can't see this screen copy of the cover of the book. And we'll get started. Now, for many Americans, when we think of traditional Chinese medicine and its history in this country, we think of this: acupuncture and the nationwide frenzy for it in the 1970s. But of course, acupuncture is just one of many traditional Chinese therapies, and its discovery, or I would argue its rediscovery in the 1970s, is in fact the end point of my book and not its beginning. Chinese medicine has a long history in the United States, dating back to the colonial period and extending up to the present. Long before mass migration from China to the United States, Chinese materia medica crossed the ocean in both directions. In the 1850s, as the first waves of Chinese immigrants began coming to America, doctors were among them. There were a wide range of healing practices in China, but up until the 1970s, immigrant doctors tended to come from a sort of middling class of merchant physicians who learned diagnosis by pulse or pulsology and herbalism in family businesses. Now, back home in China, they would have specialized in a single proprietary remedy, but abroad, they became general practitioners. They diagnosed and treated all manner of ailments. Many of them did things like setting bones. Sometimes they delivered babies. Sometimes they provided abortions. Chinese doctors in America served both Chinese and non-Chinese patients, and they advertised their services in English and Spanish language newspapers. And over time, Chinese medicine, along with other medical knowledge systems deemed irregular or alternative, both facilitated and undermined the consolidation of Western-style medical science. So my book, Herbs and Roots, chronicles roughly 200 years of the history of Chinese medicine in the United States. It is a history of transplantations and transformations, but it's also a history of American medicine. It's a history of its regularization and its professionalization, and a history of Chinese immigrant life. Now, before I go kind of deeper into the major findings of the book, I want to talk a little bit about how I came to this project. As Jean said, I was trained as a social historian. I concentrated in the 19th century American West. My first book, which is this one, was very much squarely in that field. It concerned squatters and the politics of claiming land in Gilded Age California. But in writing that book, I really learned a lot about the kind of history I like to do. And what I like to do most is research ordinary people, to find their kind of scattered records and follow them through time. Now, as I was finishing up this book and looking for a new project that would let me do that kind of research, I was teaching in Oregon. And just about anyone and everyone in Oregon becomes familiar with this guy, Dr. Ying He. From 1888 to 1948, Ying He sold traditional Chinese remedies at a quite remarkable apothecary called Kamwacheng, located way out east in the state in a town called John Day, very rural community. When Ying He was too elderly and too infirm to run his business any longer, his nephew, who was also an herbalist, moved into a nursing home in Portland and just closed the door on this building, just kind of locked it up and left everything behind, gathering dust for nearly 30 years. In the 1970s, the state assumed control of the property, and they discovered a treasure trove of historical artifacts. It's kind of like Tutankhamun's tomb. There's tins and jars and boxes of remedies, the company records, personal letters, personal effects, and so forth. Today, Kamwacheng is a state heritage site. You can go there. It's an archive. It's a museum. And Ying He has been the subject of an award-winning documentary that aired on Oregon Public Broadcasting. So I became aware of Ying He while I was living in Oregon. And as any good social historian would, I began to wonder about others like him. You know, how many Chinese doctors were practicing in the United States? Where were they? What did they do? And more broadly, I wanted to understand what their lived experiences could tell us about their time and place. Up until that point, I really hadn't given much thought to writing about the Chinese in America, although they played a very minor role in my first book. I am, though, a descendant of those immigrants on my mother's side. So these are pictures of some of my family members. I was actually talking to Jean about this earlier. My great-grandfather owned a store called Sing Chung in San Francisco Chinatown. So Jean, you're asking what corner it was on. It's on the corner of Grant and Clay. I didn't remember what the cross street was last night. And my grandmother was the third of his daughters and the fifth out of his 6 children. So, you know, I kind of felt like writing about Chinese Americans, writing about immigrants is a little too close to home. I didn't know if I really wanted to do that. Nonetheless, I was curious about the doctors, and I thought, you know, well, maybe I'll find enough to write an article. But, and Gilbert can attest to this, it turns out that Chinese doctors were everywhere. Everywhere there were Chinese people, there were Chinese doctors. They were in every state of the Union, as well as Canada and Mexico. But unsurprisingly, they were more numerous in the places where Chinese immigrants concentrated, so California and other parts of the American West. They were a small but significant cohort. My guess is that after 1850 in any given year, there were probably no more than about 200 practitioners of Chinese medicine working in the United States, but they assumed a sort of outsized importance in their community. They were, of course, healthcare providers, they were educators, they trained their children and extended families in traditional practices, but not all the work they did was strictly medical. Chinese apothecaries were recreational and religious centers, they were post offices. A Chinese herbalist might serve as his or her community's banker, translator, labor broker, grocer. They sponsored new arrivals and extended charity where possible. And after Chinese exclusion barred the entry of working class Chinese, some doctors participated in forgery and smuggling networks that allowed their countrymen to circumvent immigration restrictions. Now, the earliest example I found of a Chinese doctor advertising his services in the United States is this, and I've highlighted here at the bottom the date. So this fellow, in April of 1799, an advertisement ran in a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania newspaper. A man identifying himself as Chinese Dr. John Howard announced that he was seeing patients at his home on 2nd Street. Howard claimed that he had come from Canton, and he promised to treat a range of ailments with herbs and roots that he had imported directly from China. His advertisements ran in the Harrisburg newspaper throughout the spring and early summer of 1799, and then he moved to nearby Carlisle and advertised in its paper through the fall of 1800. I believe that John Howard was the first practitioner of Chinese medicine in the United States to advertise his services in English, but who was he? Was he, in fact, even Chinese? Chinese men and women did travel abroad and often at great distances prior to 1800. They certainly went to Europe, they went to India, they went to other parts of Asia, as well as Mexico and Hawaii. But relatively few Chinese migrants went to the United States or the British colonies that would become the United States. Their presence there went unrecorded until the 1810s, when a few religious students and domestic servants began to appear in the written record. So John Howard, if he was in fact Chinese, would have preceded those men's arrival by more than a decade. John Howard might have been an American pseudonym that he adopted because it was more easily pronounced and remembered by his English-speaking clientele. I honestly know very little about him. He may not have been Chinese at all, but he could have spent significant time in China, either as a foreign merchant or a missionary. He does not appear in the 1800 census manuscript for either Harrisburg or Carlisle, nor are there really any other public records of him aside from a few references in newspapers and a medical journal. For example, a Connecticut newspaper announced the opening of his business in 1800, and it listed the many diseases and afflictions he cured. It praised him. It called him a descendant of Galen and Hippocrates. But the announcement said nothing about his nativity. If he was Chinese, this Connecticut newspaper did not think it was important enough to mention. The idea that someone in South Central Pennsylvania would be practicing Chinese medicine was not very surprising because in 1800, 50 years before mass immigration from China to the United States began, Americans were, to varying degrees, already familiar with Chinese medicine. Americans in the colonial period and early republic descended from a European world with a long-standing curiosity for all things Chinese, including traditional Chinese medicine. In early America, among the educated elite, there was a great appetite for information about China, its philosophy, its history, and also medical practices. That information about medicine flowed constantly across the oceans. Formally trained American physicians often had strong ties with their colleagues in Europe. Many of them actually had their degrees from European medical colleges, and American medical libraries collected European studies of Chinese herbalism, moxibustion, and acupuncture. In 1825, this fellow on the right here of your screen, Benjamin Franklin Bakke, a physician and the grandson of the actual Benjamin Franklin, right, that famous Philadelphian, experimented with acupuncture on prisoners. And he was not alone. He wasn't the only one doing it. He reported that several American physicians had successfully employed acupuncture when treating inflammatory diseases, headaches, and other chronic pain conditions. So nearly 200 years ago now, we have an example of American physicians embracing what we now might call integrative medicine. Ordinary Americans, non-elite Americans, were more likely to encounter Chinese medicine through its drugs. Chinese materia medica traveled both to and from American shores. By the end of the 1700s, Americans from Georgia up across Appalachia to Minnesota had become major producers of wild-growing ginseng. Between 1783 and 1900, approximately 60 million pounds of ginseng was shipped to Asia from the United States. And then in the reverse direction, what you see are Chinese medicinal plants imported to the British colonies of North America, and then later to the United States via England. Usually they would be stocked at a local apothecary or sold by an itinerant drug peddler. Along with tea and rhubarb, things like cassia and camphor, while not exclusively grown in China, were very often identified with that country in American pharmacy catalogs. In early America, every family had a book of kind of domestic remedies, like stuff that you could sort of compound yourself in your home, even grow in your own garden, many of which contained mention of more esoteric Chinese remedies like Oriental bezoar, sometimes called Chinese snake stones, which were believed to be an antidote for poison. And in the early 19th century, I found reports of a remarkable plant circulating from all the way kind of from the mid-Atlantic up through New England. The plant was described as a dirty yellow root, which took the form of a vegetable in the summer and a worm in the winter. Like ginseng, the root was believed to restore energy. And I'm pretty sure what this is Cordyceps sinensis. It's a combination of fungus and caterpillar native to Tibet. And today it's sometimes referred to as Himalayan Viagra. When mass immigration from China began in the 1850s, the immigrants' need for healthcare was acute. Chinese laborers were relegated to the least desirable and most treacherous jobs. In remote work sites, Chinese laborers were often at the mercy of their employers to provide even the most basic necessities. Poverty and discrimination confined the Chinese to overcrowded and unsanitary living quarters, the perfect breeding ground for infectious disease. Violence was pervasive. Chinese immigrants were routinely denied treatment by American hospitals and physicians, or were segregated in special buildings designated for smallpox victims and lepers. So Chinese doctors came with other immigrants from their country, and they provided really essential services, especially when mainstream medical care was not an option. As I began to locate Chinese doctors in the historical record, I became interested in the way that their stories intersected with the history of American medicine more broadly. So while Herbs and Roots begins in the late 18th century and ends in the near present, my primary concern lies with the late 19th and early 20th centuries, what Americanists like myself often call the long progressive era. The late 19th and early 20th centuries, let me just give you kind of a really quick sort of framework here. They were a critical time both in the history of Chinese immigration and the history of medicine in the United States. You may know in 1882, Congress passed the first Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited working class Chinese from entering the country and caused a decline over time in the Chinese population in the United States over kind of the subsequent decades. A shrinking stock of co-ethnic customers may have compelled at least some Chinese herbalists to cast a wider net for non-Chinese patients and I do see an increase in English and Spanish language advertisements after 1882. Around the same time, a new science of disease transmission based on the germ theory was becoming popular with formally trained European and American physicians. So around the last decade or so of the 19th century, the American Medical Association began to partner with state and local governments to standardize medical education and licensing around that theory of disease. The AMA really aimed to monopolize the medical marketplace and drive unlicensed doctors, including the Chinese, out of business. So this was the moment that Chinese doctors chose to become increasingly active in the American medical marketplace. For Chinese doctors, the progressive era might not have seemed like the best time to get into the American healthcare business. And indeed, anti-Chinese racism prevented nearly all of them from sitting for licensing exams or otherwise securing the legal right to practice. So they practiced without a license and faced prosecution, they paid fines, and some of them even spent time in jail for doing so. It can be really difficult to square the American consumption of Chinese remedies with what we know about prevalent anti-Chinese racism. Throughout the 19th century, Americans embraced Orientalist perceptions of Asians as backwards, barbarous, and effeminate, and these perceptions often justified exclusionary and discriminatory policies targeting Asian nations and immigrants. Such racist thinking extended to the realm of Chinese medicine. If Chinese people were primitive, so was Chinese medical knowledge, so it was believed. Attacks on Chinese doctors and English language media frequently ridiculed their therapies as backwards or unscientific, and public health officials unfairly cited American Chinatowns as sites of contagion and pathologized Chinese bodies as disease vectors. Yet scientific medicine's monopoly on the medical marketplace was really far from complete. Chinese herb businesses flourished in the spaces where regular doctors had not yet consolidated their control. And I argue that for American patients who were skeptical of modern medical science, criticism of Chinese medicine could also constitute its allure. To understand the success of Chinese medicine in the American medical marketplace, we have to look at how Chinese herbalists sold Chinese medicine to non-Chinese patients. So in the book, I detail how Chinese doctors effectively used their advertising to self-orientalize. They played on their non-Chinese patients' racialized expectations of Asian cultures in honestly multiple and sometimes kind of contradictory ways. They overcame anti-Chinese racism by embracing and perpetuating anti-Chinese racism. And we see this most acutely in their advertising's deliberately, the deliberate use of stereotypically Oriental imagery and ideas. And my talk today will focus on one of those, the idea of nature and natural medicine. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, American accounts describe Chinese medicine as nature's remedies, and they describe Chinese doctors as uniquely attuned to nature. Meanwhile, Chinese doctors advertising in English language media deployed the same language of natural medicine to sell their services to non-Chinese patients. So one of the central arguments in my book is that in the progressive era, Chinese herbalists promoted their services through two distinct but highly compatible cultural languages: natural medicine and American Orientalism. In the American medical marketplace, the discourse of natural medicine first took shape in the early 19th century when municipalities first began to kind of regulate the practice of medicine. These regulations were pretty feeble, they're poorly enforced, but they nonetheless gave some legitimacy to the practices of formally trained, mostly white, mostly male physicians. And in so doing, they begin to draw this sort of circle of authority around what we now think of as regular or scientific medicine. Outside of that circle were practitioners deemed irregular. And these were usually self-taught or informally trained healers whose ranks very often included women and people of color. They tended to use less invasive procedures, and they tended to prescribe simple animal or plant-based compounds rather than the mineral-based compounds preferred by their regular counterparts. So in the early 19th century, these common practices and principles allowed irregular doctors to claim a kind of special authority over or a special connection with nature, something essential, something very universal. And they promoted medical systems that relied on things like self-diagnosis, self-dosing, non-invasive procedures, and importantly, these non-synthetic plant and animal-based drugs. So that term nature cures became really common parlance by the mid-19th century, and it just sort of continued through the progressive era. Like the Chinese Exclusion Act and expanding medical regulation, this discourse of natural medicine was a product of larger processes of modernization in the United States, processes that were really provoking new anxieties about the meanings of nature and human connections with it. So for late 19th century Americans, for many of them, modernization and modern medicine more specifically, seemed to really be severing that connection between human bodies and nature in ways that could be at least disturbing, if not outright frightening. Chinese doctors practicing in the United States at the time freely borrowed from the discourse of natural medicine to promote their services to non-Chinese patients. And it was easy for them to do it, not only because their therapies did, in fact, favor non-invasive procedures and plant and animal-based remedies, but also because Orientalism had already conditioned American patients to perceive Chinese medicine as primitive, backwards, in other words, the opposite of modern, and therefore closer to an unmodernized natural world. The earliest newspaper advertisements for Chinese medicine were really just a few lines, usually the doctor's name, office location, and perhaps his specialties. But in the 1880s, some enterprising physicians and herb companies began to include images, most commonly a picture of the practitioner wearing a very easily identifiable Oriental costume. One of the earliest examples is this, and it's very tiny, and I blew it up. That's why it doesn't look very clear. This is an advertisement for Los Angeles Dr. Hui Kung, which includes this very simple line drawing of a man in a traditional Chinese jacket and trousers holding a flower. In this economy of images, the illustration conveyed the racial identity of the doctor and his expertise in botanical medicines. So appeals to nature's remedies were really one important tactic in the Chinese doctor's advertising arsenal. Chinese doctors frequently promoted the image of Chinese medicine based on pure and growing things, as opposed to minerals or chemicals or poisons or drugs associated with Western-style medicine. And that association goes all the way back to 1799, when John Howard was selling Chinese herbs and roots out of his rented room in Pennsylvania. And it resurfaced again in 1877, when Dr. Afo promised no poisonous medicines to his Oakland clientele. References to nature became more prevalent in English language advertisements for Chinese medicine after 1890, as states increasingly mandated those public exams and licensure for healthcare providers. Between 1890 and 1894, this fellow, who's the sort of like disembodied head floating above his office building, his name is Chang Chi-wo, initially based in Omaha, Nebraska. He was running ads in various Midwestern newspapers touting his wonderful, marvelous, miraculous cures, which were in fact nature's remedies tested for thousands of years in China. So it's all quotes in there. Some 30 years later, having moved to Portland, Oregon, Chang continued to appeal to nature. He insisted that his prescriptions were, quote, nature's own remedies and contained no poisonous minerals or drugs. A reputation for dispensing nature's remedies became a way for unlicensed Chinese physicians to distinguish themselves and attract patients distrustful of state-sanctioned modern medical science. In its turn of the 20th century advertising, Los Angeles Fu and Wing Herb Company asserted that herbal remedies were, quote, founded upon a complete understanding of nature's laws. Americans carried their theories of science to extremes and get too far away from the simple, fundamental facts upon which health depends. Chinese physicians used English language advertising to demystify their practices and to draw comparisons with American folk traditions. Fu and Wing explained that Chinese herbs were, in essence, vegetables. Consuming them was no different from eating regular food. And such images worked against the supposed exoticism of Chinese medicine that have been cultivated by popular images of apothecaries kind of packed with desiccated animal and human body parts. Chinese doctors in the United States seem to have been successful in their campaign to associate their health practices with natural medicine, although very few of them ever secured a medical license from the state. They did attract a non-Chinese clientele that defended their right to dispense those nature's remedies in public testimony and in popular and academic publications. But selling Chinese medicine as natural medicine did not come naturally to its practitioners. Non-Chinese patients may have interpreted nature's remedies as a translation of exotic and ancient Chinese natural philosophy. But I argue it was more likely an adoption of an American medical vernacular. The meanings of nature in traditional Chinese medicine were not directly translatable into Euro-American categories. Traditional Chinese medicine, kind of as a compilation of doctrines and practices, did not conceive of nature as the opposite of science or modernity, nor were herbs more natural than minerals by virtue of being organic rather than inorganic substances. When Chinese doctors began immigrating to the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, principles of let's say, principles of the relationship between human bodies and the environment, what you might think of as environmental health, were undergoing some reconsideration, right? So we have to kind of think like, was there an emerging sense of natural medicine or environmental health in China in the moment when these doctors were leaving and going to the United States? And we do see some evidence of that. Between the 1850s and 1870s, Southern scholar physicians developed a sort of consensus that the treatment of certain diseases must depend on local qi. That is, on the conditions of the patient's physical environment. The herbalists who immigrated to the United States were not typically part of that elite scholarly class that was engaging in such debates, but they may very well have been aware of those theories of local qi, and they may have incorporated them into their clinical work. It's more likely that immigrant Chinese doctors were aware of changing approaches to drug therapy that were circulating in family medicine from the 1880s into the kind of early 20th century. Among family doctors, there was a movement among herbalists to prescribe very bland, very light drugs that harmonized with one another to restore balance in the body. This therapeutic method of harmonization and moderation, as it was called, was a way for family doctors to distinguish their services from kind of folk healers, sort of lower class folk healers, who tended to peddle very powerful purgatives. And its gentle approach to drug therapy, that principle of harmonization and moderation, bore some similarity to the American understanding of natural medicine, but its logic was not rooted in a concept of some kind of primitive or anti-modern nature. Nonetheless, I did want to see if the discourse of natural medicine featured in herbalists' Chinese language advertisements that were circulating in the United States in immigrant newspapers. So with the help of research assistants, I looked at a sample of roughly 75 advertisements from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So these are from newspapers printed in Chinese, but circulating in the United States. And I really found no references to local qi, nor to other terms that might be linked to harmony, moderation, or balance. Instead, advertisements tended to emphasize the expertise and skill of the practitioner, his or her reputation for curing diseases where other doctors had failed, and sometimes his or her training in Western medical colleges or hospitals. Chinese medicine continues to be more closely associated with nature in the American popular imagination. Today, the coupling of Chinese herbal remedies and nature has become so commonplace that American consumers hardly question it. Specialty retailers sell plastic pill bottles like these, bearing pictures of bamboo, flowers, a field of grass, and birds. Occasionally, a label features a male or female figure costumed in robes and caps from pre-modern China and framed by tree branches, a mountainous vista, or other images conveying their embeddedness in nature. the images on the outside of the bottle rarely correspond to the ingredients inside. Critics of biomedical science continue to characterize conventional pharmaceuticals as toxic or unnatural. Chinese herbal remedies, on the other hand, are presumed to be unsynthesized or closer to their original state as plants, animals, or minerals, and thus safer, so we might think, to consume. Numerous dangers to human and non-human health stem from such assumptions. That supposed closeness to nature has not led to sustainable relationships with the material environment from which traditional remedies are sourced. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. We can look at, for example, the overforaging of wild ginseng in North America, the poaching of wild animals like tigers, bears, rhinos, pangolins, etc. We also need to know a lot more than we do about the side effects of using traditional Chinese remedies, particularly when they're used in conjunction with other medicines. We do know there can be adverse health outcomes such as bleeding, kidney and liver damage, and even depression. My book ends with a history that is still very much unfolding, which is the valiant efforts among Chinese and Chinese American scientists from the 1970s to today to fill in these gaps in our knowledge, to effectively de-orientalize Chinese medicine by explaining its efficacy through Western-style scientific models and methods. And I think that their work might eventually mitigate some of those latter dangers. Biomedical scientists have been, though predictably slow to embrace Chinese therapies, and which remain largely inaccessible to the average patient. But the deliberate speed of Western-style science is really not solely to blame here. After generations of successful self-orientalizing, practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine really have few incentives to de-orientalize. In the American medical marketplace, Chinese medicine has thrived as an alternative and not a complement to regular medicine. That close association between Chinese medicine and nature has been a major source of its practitioners' legitimacy and power, and that seems very unlikely to change. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm really happy to take questions. I think Jean is gonna moderate the Q&A, so I will just stop sharing here and wait for Jean's direction. I think I've lost, Jean, have I lost you? Should I just, I can't see the Q&A, but I can see a question from Felicia. I could start with that. Felicia is asking me, when patients came to a Chinese doctor, were the doctors actually dressed in exotic costume as in the ads? Do patients get disappointed to see a Chinese doctor? That's to see a Chinese doctor in Western clothing. Oh, now Jean, you're in. Should I answer Felicia's question about the costumes? Yeah, okay. You're muted, but I think you're saying yes. Okay, so that's a great question. So kind of the short answer is yes. And sometimes, honestly, that was just how they dressed, you know, if we go back far enough in time. But one of the great stories that I learned, I did some oral histories with children of Chinese herbalists. One of the great stories I heard a fellow named Calvin Fong, whose father was a very prominent, very successful herbalist in Oakland in the kind of the first decades of the 20th century. Calvin was his youngest son and was born in the 1940s, but anyway, he by that point, he was an older dad by that point, so he had been around for quite a while. Anyway, so Calvin's dad was like a very dapper dude. You know, he always dressed in a Western style 3-piece suit. You know, he didn't go out without a hat. You know, just very formal, very professional kind of guy. But then when he went to work in his herb shop, he would dress like in the Mandarin cap and gown, because it's true. And he's not the only example of that. Another doctor, a female doctor, Margaret Chung, who was actually an MD, also found that if she dressed in a Western style, that her patients were, her non-Chinese patients were kind of like thrown off by that. So they very deliberately dressed themselves for the part. They decorated their offices with the sort of wood carvings and scrolls and the statues and such to kind of create a theatrical sort of experience that they knew their non-Chinese patients were seeking. I mean, Okay.
Okay, yeah, I have a question here from Michael Tom. So glad to hear your presentation. My cousins and I are grandchildren of Tom Hao Wing. Our extended family of Tom Fuyun are compiling our family history. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe you can comment on some of the different Tom families that have been who have a stellar reputation in at least in our local area.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's so many, all the Toms. And actually, I think I've been in touch with your cousin. I think she emailed me about your family reunion. I think you're probably all part of the same set. Yeah. So Tom Fuyun, who's probably the nephew by marriage of an even more famous Chinese herbalist named Li Po Tai, who was in San Francisco. Tom Fuyun is this like amazingly entrepreneurial guy. He and his kind of a series of cousins. Well, first they got trained up in Li Po Tai's shop up in San Francisco, and then went around establishing different herb businesses. And I do write a fair bit about him and also Tom Leung, who was based down here in Southern California and is another kind of member of the extended Tom family. But yeah, I think herbalism really runs strong in that family. But it's just a reminder that these businesses were family businesses. They were. It's true in China. It's true here. People apprenticed with their family to learn this trade. And one thing that I found in the book, which I thought was sort of interesting, was that in the early part of the 20th century, you get this sort of generation of American-born Chinese who were growing up with their immigrant parents, seeing how hard they worked, seeing how often they were arrested or fined for practicing, and yet they wanted to work in the medical profession. They wanted to, follow in their parents' footsteps. And so many of them ended up going into licensed professions. It seems to be so common. You find folks whose parents were herbalists end up becoming pharmacists or chiropractors or doctors. This is true of my uncle Edmund, his dad was an herbalist in Visalia up in Northern California. And then he became actually one of the very first, this is my great uncle, he became one of the very first American-born Chinese men to get an MD. He got his MD at UCSF after, I think, failing out of Stanford. I don't actually know, and now he's dead, so I can't ask him, but I think he failed at Stanford and had to go to UCSF, but we're very proud of him anyway.
There are more questions coming, but I'd like to interject with one question here. Did the Toms, I think maybe you commented, were they all from a certain region or area? Did you have any background on that?
So in this era, pretty much anyone who's coming to the United States is from southern China, and mostly what was then called Canton Province or Guangzhou. I don't recall if all the Toms came from the same village, but they're certainly from this same region in southern China, and that has a lot to do with just like patterns of outmigration and what was possible for people in China who wanted to leave. People from Fujian are coming, certainly kind of other provinces, but there's a real kind of cluster of outmigration from this one part of China.
Yeah, I think it contributes to the concept of chain migration, where a successful practitioner might invite others from the same area or others from the family to join them in the practice.
And of course, right? Because of Chinese exclusion, or after Chinese exclusion, you really had to be connected to someone to come. Sorry, go ahead. Question, okay. Q&A.
Well, yeah, no, there's a whole slew of questions here, but I'll let me see, read the next one. So during your research, did you get a sense of the percentage of European Americans and Chinese patients seeing Chinese herbalists? And were there more Chinese or European American patients?
So this would depend according to the practitioner, right? But there were practitioners, Chinese practitioners, who had 0 Chinese patients, whose entire clientele was white. And so I mentioned, I did some interviews with the children of these herbalists. And one of them, a woman named Anna Dawn, whose father, Chan Du-sung, was kind of which the way she describes it is his uncle started the McDonald's of Chinese herb shops. So he franchised it. And her father, who trained in an Oakland branch, ended up founding all these other branches across the American West. And what she said is that he would deliberately not open a shop in the Chinese part of town. And this was not unique to him. A lot of Chinese herbalists after about like 1890, 1900, so not at first, not the first generation, but kind of the second generation of immigrant doctors would deliberately open up in white parts of town and practice there. And I have some theories in the book about why that is. Part of it might have been kind of what I referred to in the talk, that the turn of the 20th century was a moment where American Chinatowns were really being identified as sites of epidemic disease. And so it may have made sense for Chinese herbalists to locate elsewhere to kind of try to sever that perceived connection between them and these supposedly sort of racially unsanitary places.
And perhaps the market was for those with the expendable income to spend on various new types of remedies.
And they had two price lists. I should say that too. Chinese herbalists always had two price lists. They had what they charged the Chinese and what they charged the white patients. And you can imagine what they charged the white patients was significantly more. They were good business people.
Well, yes, that's what it was. Here's another one. What is the most often cited Chinese remedy or treatment to be acknowledged by Western medicine? Were there some that were
right now
recognized? Yeah.
Right now, well, probably ginseng, I would guess. Ginseng's in just about anything. But of course, there's ginkgo biloba. There are, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I feel like those are kind of the ones that are most mass marketed.
Yeah.
You get something with ginseng, I can't see. Oh,
this is bitter melon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
From Sprouts.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, Sprouts, Target. I think that's one of the most remarkable things that's happened in my lifetime, is the way in which this kind of mainstreaming of Chinese medicine. I grew up with my grandmother, like going to Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown, to those shops, right? And they have it in like the giant bags or the giant glass bottles, like you scoop it out by the pound. And now you can go to Target and find this stuff. So yeah, it's kind of everywhere now.
So it's joined the mainstream. Here's a question here. We lived in China and often used Chinese medicine even before we lived there. Mm-hmm. And let's see, an aniseed-based insomnia medicine really helped me without the side effects of sleeping pills from the Chinese pharmacy in Thailand. Have you used Chinese medicine?
I have. So my grandma gave it to me. The first time I took Chinese herbs, my grandmother gave it. She, all Chinese people, they put it in a soup or they steep it in hot water and drink it like a tea. And so not like capsulized version. So my grandma made me a tea. I wasn't feeling well. I can't remember what was wrong with me. And I just like promptly threw up. I mean, I couldn't keep it down. And she goes, "Oh, that's how you know it's working." So I didn't take Chinese medicine for a long time after that. I actually didn't do it again until I started writing this book. And I thought, I really ought to be kind of the experimental porcupine here and learn something about this. So I've had acupuncture for insomnia. And also I had a shoulder problem. I had cupping. I got moxibustion and cupping. So I've tried herbs. I've definitely I've experimented, but I'll say it's not a principal part of my own medical self-care.
Yeah, I think most of us who grew up in or near Chinatown had a lot of experience with one or another type of treatment by a Chinese practitioner. Here's one. My grandfather mixed herbs in a shop in LA. What kind of training is required? And is that still true for today's herbal shops?
Gosh, I don't really know. So now as an herbalist, you in this country, you are licensed. I mean, now it's a licensed profession. It's licensed under the same sort of regime as acupuncture. So I can't recall right now off the top of my head what the acronym is, but it's all kind of part of one license. But back in the day,
there are schools that train individuals in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. And then in California, there's a license I think you can obtain. I don't know if
in almost every state
there is under that.
Yeah. So, but probably, I don't know how the vintage of your relative, but prior to that, you would learn to do that in the family business. You'd be apprenticed, and yeah.
Okay. We have a really enthusiastic audience here, so I'm going to try and go through some of these questions here. I'm a cousin of Michael Tom, granddaughter of Tom Hao Wing. And do you know if any of the herbalists have written down their recipes? I remember having a particular herbal soup after I gave birth to my 3 daughters and wondered about it.
You know what? I have a book. I'm in my office right now. I think it's up there, but I won't get it down. But I actually have a recipe book that has a soup for postpartum mothers. Yes. So these doctors, they did write down. They had one of the things I do have are prescription pads from doctors in the United States. They are nearly impossible to translate, and I have had people who are actually like their job is to do this kind of translation, and they'll look at it and say, this could be this, or this could be that. And they'll very often use kind of modern compounds, so modern recipes, if you will, to try to ferret out what it is that these folks were actually compounding in their shops. And it's interesting. There are a couple things that are interesting about that. One is that very often in the American West, Chinese herbalists were doing mail order business. So basically, you would not go into the shop. You would write down your symptoms and mail it in to the doctor. And that might be because you were living too far away from the doctor to go in, or I don't know, it was more convenient for you for whatever reason. And so the Chinese, so one theory about why the prescription pads look like they do is that these doctors were prescribing at a distance, and they were just like, I'm not sure what's going on with this person. I'm going to put everything in here and see how it goes. The other thing is that there's a significant amount of substitution going on. So if they couldn't get one thing, they would try to substitute for another. Most of what they had was imported directly from China through wholesalers, but there was a fair amount of kind of experimenting with local supplies, like local plants, local animals. So these prescriptions can look very bizarre, and there should be more. I mean, it's really neat when they turn up. So there are museums and archives that have some of them, and they're really cool records of a sort of particular time and place.
In your contacts with descendants of herbalists, didn't you find some notes and recipes in cigar boxes or the Tupperware boxes?
Yeah, the children kept, and then they were very happy to give them away. They're like, here, I don't want this anymore. So we have some now in our library here at the Claremont colleges.
Okay, let's see. Here's more of a comment. Herbalists usually don't pass this information on to daughters or females. Lisa Lau in Chicago is a 3rd generation descendant of a Chinese herbalist taught by her father. Is it still common to pass on to males only, the male heirs, and not the females?
I honestly don't know now. I mean, it's true that almost all. Okay, so I should say, I went into this project believing that all herbalists were men because of because of Chinese culture being patriarchal as it was and is. But in fact, what I learned in the process of doing the research is that women were there. They were never the front office people. They were never the people who actually interfaced with patients, but they were almost always in the back room compounding medicine. So I have to believe that this sort of cultural assumption that men didn't pass on their recipes to their daughters, that might have been kind of the company line or what families put out to the world. But given the number of women I have found working in the kitchen, compounding medicine, I have to believe that they were getting plenty of information passed down to them.
I would say that through my mother and grandmother, I learned a lot of my rudimentary knowledge of healthy things to take, for various things. That question, by the way, came from Sulan Moy from the Chinese American Museum in Chicago. Hi, cousin. Anyway, I see a lot of friends here. And to all friends out there, there are a lot of questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to try to pick and choose some of these that seem like it might be helpful for the larger audience here. Since many of the herbs are also used in Africa and maybe other native medicinal practices, why isn't there an inclusive term for this kind of non-Western medicine? Or is all herbal medicine called Chinese medicine?
Why is it called Chinese medicine, or what was? Sorry, I kind of missed the. So I mean, there are some inclusive terms. I think you could say.
I know that in the Latino community, one goes to a botanica.
Yeah,
and
botanica.
You might speak to somebody who can treat you the same way a Chinese doctor would.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing about herbal medicine, this is something I talk about in the book. Pretty much prior to the early part of the 20th century, there are no synthetic drugs. I mean, there are, the first synthetic drugs are produced in the late 19th century, but it's really not until the early 20th century that anyone can mass produce synthetic drugs. And so everything is basically derived from these natural substances. And one of the things that I really liked thinking about in the writing of this book was how it is that our concepts of what is scientific or unscientific or natural or unnatural or regular or irregular are formed over the course of many years of kind of defining in opposition to one another. So I talk about this sort of circle of authority that gets drawn around Western style biomedical science eventually. I mean, that's something that's highly cultural and highly contingent. It's not something that was sort of, that is to say, it was built up over time and through a lot of assumptions. So, if you look at the American Pharmacopoeia, that's the sort of compendium of all known medicinal ingredients in the United States. It's produced decennially. If you look at it and you compare it to a traditional Chinese pharmacopoeia, they're almost identical up until a certain date. I mean, they're all kind of drawing on the same readily available substances. The Chinese tend to do a little bit more. If you think about a ratio, they tend to do a little bit more in kind of plant and animal. There's a little bit more mineral in the US pharmacopoeia, but it's all kind of the same stuff.
There were several questions or comments about training for traditional Chinese medicine. One is actually a current student training in TCM. And she mentions that that it is there is a national license for a practitioner, and also in California. And another commented that there is a 4-year master's degree and state licensing to become a licensed acupuncturist in addition to medicinal practice.
So that's all post 1975. All of that has developed in the last 45 years. There's nothing like that in this earlier period. There's no licensing for that until after 1975. And we can thank acupuncturists for all of that.
Yeah, and I think that entered the realm of legitimacy here. Let me scroll down here. So many of those medical advertisements, and I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, medical advertisements placed by Chinese doctors from Washington and Oregon depict the Chinese doctor in a business suit, a Western business suit, whereas in LA and San Francisco, the doctors wore a traditional robe. Why could this be?
Well, I don't know that it was strictly that. So Chinese practitioners after about 1905 do start portraying themselves in kind of Western style suit and tie. But then also, so I'm actually thinking there's one of the female herbalists who I write about who went by I'm sort of blanking on her name, but she always went by Mrs. and her husband's name. That's how she presented herself in her advertisements. She kind of switched back and forth. She was based in Portland, and she would have some ads where she appeared in a kind of Mandarin scholar costume, and then others where she was wearing a more traditional, like Victorian, women's Victorian garb. So I don't think it was actually regional in that way.
Did Ing He in Oregon wear Western clothing?
He did, yeah. He wore both, and actually, I actually think with him, I have so much more about him. I know so much more about him than I know versus almost anyone else. I actually think for him, it was like he wore Chinese clothes when he was young and in his 30s and 40s and had just arrived. And as he got older, he just sort of adopted the kind of clothes that Eastern Oregonians were wearing, trousers and suspenders and shirts. Because I do. With his photos, because I have photos from him over the span of much of his life, I think I actually can see a kind of change in how he dresses himself.
And maybe you commented earlier, and I just didn't hear, his office and his residence are now a state park.
Yeah, it's a state park with the museum there. And it's really one of the very few, it is certainly the best archive of Chinese medicine in the United States. There are other places, museums and traditional archives that have collected sort of the ephemera associated with these businesses. But Kamwachung is really the best one. It's just such an amazing collection, and they've kind of restored it to a certain date. I've forgotten what date they chose, but they chose a sort of certain moment in what was a 60-year history of that business to recreate on site. So you can go. It's a 5-hour drive from Portland. It's not close to Portland, but it's pretty, and you can kind of have a tour. It's a neat place.
And isn't there something? The story of what was found under his bed?
Oh no, I don't know what was found under his bed.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, having visited there before, that's what the ranger really made a point of discussing was that under his cot, under his bed, after he passed, and the folks went through there to see, what they should do with his possessions. Was that under his bed was a box with $20,000 worth of personal checks from his patients, people he had treated. But because he just treated people, took care of people as a favor, I think that he just never bothered to cash in his checks.
Wow, I have never heard that before.
So I don't know if this is real or not. This is what the Rangers are telling us.
He was beloved. He still is, because I wrote about him, and the woman I showed, the picture of him and Maud Truesdale that I showed in the slideshow, I wrote about him. I was writing about him maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and one of these people who knew Maud Truesdale wrote to me. I mean, he's still kind of remembered in a secondhand way.
Let's see, a little slightly different
Oh, you know what? I
comment.
think we got a notice to wrap up, Eugene.
Oh,
I don't
we're
want
having a great time, aren't we?
mad at us.
So
She
yeah,
seems like
yeah, I think we have.
very...
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple more. I think
Okay.
we can squeak by. Were there any challenges around importing herbs from China back at that time?
Oh my gosh,
And
so
how-
many. So I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. I mean, so obviously things were preserved, they were prepared for long distance shipment, right? So you know, things were kind of specially produced for this trans-Pacific trade. But things arrived spoiled, they arrived infested with bugs, there were shortages. And then, you know, kind of between the end of the 1930s and all the way through 1971, it was kind of impossible to get anything from China. First, because of the wars, and then because of the embargo on Chinese goods. You couldn't import anything in packages larger than 20 pounds. So Chinese herbalists, and I write about this in the book, kind of in, you know, the double whammy of the Great Depression and then World War II and the embargo on Chinese goods really crushed the business in the United States. And they had ways of kind of dealing with that and sourcing in other places or importing kind of via Japan or via Hong Kong, which is a, you know, British possession. But yeah, Chinese doctors had a lot of trouble getting what they needed for a long time.
Well, in addition to that, didn't the local authorities constantly harass our Chinese doctors for practicing illegal medicine?
Oh yeah, well kind of separate issue from stocking their shelves. No, they were constantly subjected to fines and jail time. You know, licensed medical doctors would go and pose as patients and try to entrap them. I mean, it was a real kind of Wild West sort of situation. And when you talk to the children of Chinese herbalists, they'll say things like, well, you know, dad always had a lawyer. You know, dad just kind of went and spent a night in jail and then came home and got back to work. That's the sort of prevailing sense I get, is that they just sort of accepted this as a cost of doing business and they didn't try to hide. Gilbert's, is it your uncle or your grandfather? Now I've forgotten. I think it's your great uncle, maybe. I don't know. Gilbert will correct me if I'm wrong here.
Grandfather, S.P. Lee.
It was your grandfather? His grandfather used the cover of his son's medical licenses, chiropractic licenses, I think, to practice illegally. So he was doing his unlicensed stuff, but his sons were licensed and kind of gave him cover.
There are just lots of good questions still, but we're really running out of time. But
I'll come back when the book is 2 years old.
we come back, but
well,
also
you can buy the book.
Yeah, the book is available, right? And the Chinese Historical Society library does have a copy now, and so it's available for people to come and read. I can't loan it out, but
or you
it's
could
available.
go. It's on Amazon. You can. It's
Yeah.
a lovely stocking stuffer. Thinking about Christmas.
Yeah, no, I think it's really a great subject for us today when we're asking questions about the effectiveness of medicine. You know, is it science? Can we inject bleach and cure ourselves? So
no.
what?
I'm not a medical doctor, but no.
Right. But well, you know, I mean, that's one point to make, is that a lot of the Chinese medicine, of course, evolved through generations, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years of observation. So anyway, we need to close, and I need to turn the podium over to our president. But as I mentioned earlier, our programs are going to be available on YouTube And what you do is go to our website at chssc.org to get lots of information in addition to background and announcements of our programs. And also you can join as a member. We are at the end of the year, and this is the time when we really start inviting our members and friends to join us, because that's what keeps us going. We have 2 historic homes at our headquarters. We have a library. We have great archives. We've actually recently received several grants to support additional work at our archives. We have interns working with us remotely to help us with digitizing our documents and organizing our digital files. We have a great new digital network installed with a server. So we're hopefully going to be a good resource for the long term, but we can't do it without support from your contributions and from members. Join at the appropriate membership level. If you're a member, you will get a copy free of our annual Gumsan Journal, and this month's or this year's issue is a special one about some Chinatown families. And I think you'll want to pick up a copy. So I'll turn this over to Susan Dixon, our president, for some last comments.
Okay, Eugene just took all my comments, but I wanted just to mention in terms of the membership, normally we just have the one Gumsan Journal, and this one is on Chinatown in the 50s, but this summer we will also be having another one on the journalist Charles Young. So also I want to thank China Society for co-sponsoring this, and thank you for attending our program. Sorry you couldn't hear me before, but I figured it out. Good night.